I am.
Hi students, my name is Ben. I'm the director of the Eudora Community Museum, which is right behind me here. Typically at this time of year, third grade students from Eudora Elementary, they come visit our museum, and we also go on a walking tour of downtown Eudora. Now we can't do that this year because of the pandemic, but I figured instead of you being able to come here in person, I could take you on a walking tour through this video, and we can also go on a tour of the museum as well, so you guys can get to see and experience what all the other third grade students get to experience. And then hopefully someday when this pandemic is over and it's safe to meet in groups again, you guys can all come down here to our museum and you can see it in person, and we can go on a walking tour in person as well. So that's my hope that we can do in the future. But in the meantime, I'll start telling you about some of these historic buildings we have here in downtown Eudora. This building behind me, this is 720 Main Street, and as I said, this is our museum building. Our museum building is one of the oldest buildings in downtown Eudora. It's one of the oldest buildings in Kansas, actually. It was first built in 1866, and that's only 9 years after the city of Eudora was founded in 1857. And our building was built as a tin shop. There was a man that worked out of here who put tin, which is kind of metal, on people's ceilings, and then he lived with his family on the second story of this building. And then in 2013, our museum, we were given this building, and we spent a couple of years restoring it, fixing it up to make sure we could have our museum inside of it. And we'll go inside the museum in a minute, and you'll see the different types of items we have on display in the museum. But right now, we're going to go up Main Street, and I'm going to point out some of the more historic buildings to you. This building right here, this building is our neighbor. This is 714 Main Street. From what I can tell, it's the oldest building in downtown Eudora. Based on my research, it was built in 1860, which is before the Civil War started. And this building was built by a man named Asher Cohen. He was a grocer, and he was also the leader of Eudora's Jewish community. And right now, the building just got put on the National Register of Historic Places, which is an honor. And they're actually going to fix up the building here pretty soon, so people will be able to go inside again, and it'll be a normal business again. Right now, there's nobody in it, but we're real excited that it's going to get fixed up. And then our next stop, I'll show you, is what used to be the Wakarusa Brewery. A brewery is a place where they make beer, sell beer. Unfortunately, they're not in business anymore, but this was Eudora's first brewery in a long time. This was our first brewery in Eudora since 1881. Eudora was a town that was founded by Germans, and Germans really like beer. So there were a lot of breweries in the early part of Eudora's history. And this was another brewery we had, but that was the last one we had, and we don't have a brewery currently. This building right here, this is 706 Main Street. It's also a very old building. It was built in the 1870s. And when this building was first built, it was a saloon, or it was a tavern, it was a bar. It was a place where all the men in town would go and they'd have some drinks. And it was built by a man named Marphilius. This building right here, that's right behind me, is 700 Main Street. This building was built in 1897, and when it was first built, it was the largest and fanciest building in all of Eudora. This was home to the Kaw Valley Bank. That's what is today Eudora's oldest business. They've been around since 1897. And what's really cool about this building is on the second story of this building was a place called the Lighthouse Opera House. The Lighthouse Opera House was a 300-seat auditorium. So basically, people put on stage shows up there, musicals, plays, stuff like that. And then later on, there was a movie theater up there as well, on the second story of this building. The town actually did have a real movie theater too for some time. Over there across the street, where that little white building is, that's the city administrator's building today. That's where Eudora's movie theater was. We had a movie theater there called the Victory Theater, and it was built in 1942, and sadly it burned down in 1966, and we haven't had a movie theater in Eudora ever since then. But that was a pretty important place in Eudora because people didn't really have TVs at that time. So that was really the only place to go to be able to watch movies, was in that movie theater. And it's a shame we don't have a movie theater anymore here. This is the original City of Eudora school bell. This bell dates to about 1860. It hung in the Eudora schoolhouse. Right where I'm standing right now is in front of City Hall. But before this building was built, there was another building right here. That was a small white building that I'll show you in a second. It got moved. But the building that was built here in 1860 was the first schoolhouse in Eudora. And they built a new school a few years later, and so this old schoolhouse became City Hall. And in 1955, they moved the old building and they built this new brick building. This building was built in 1955. And thankfully, we've managed to save the original Eudora school bell. School bells were really important at that part in time in Eudora because in the 1860s, people didn't have clocks. So most people didn't have any idea what time it was. So in the morning, the teacher would ring this bell, or sometimes a student would ring this bell, and that would let everyone in town know it's time to go to school. And then later on, when school got out, the teacher would ring the bell again, and then all the parents would know that school's out and the children should be home soon. And what a lot of children tried to do is when they got done with school, they tried to go off and play, or they tried to, have some fun. But the bell rung, and that meant parents knew little Johnny should be home in 10 minutes. If he's not home in 10 minutes, that means he's off playing. Children usually had to go right home after school because they had a lot of chores to do. It's not like today where everything is done for us. Back then, kids had to do a lot of the work around the house. They had to do cleaning, they had to get eggs from the chickens. There was a whole lot of things kids had to do. Girls had to assist their moms with the laundry. So you really didn't have much time for play. And so that's why the school bell was a really important part of the community. Behind me is the Pillow House. When this house was built, it was by far the nicest and largest house in Eudora. It was built in 1894, and it was owned by the Pillow family. They were a prominent family in Eudora because they ran the town's grocery store, the general store. So they became pretty rich. And with all their money, they built that house. And today it's placed on the National Register of Historic Places. Right now I'm standing in Pillow Park. Some of you guys have probably played in this park before. Down there at the end of the hill, that's where the Eudora train tracks are. The train tracks first came to Eudora in 1872. And before cars were invented, most people got around by train or by horses. But trains were by far the fastest way that people could travel from place to place back then. So the trains were pretty important. And Eudora had its own train depot as well, but it burned down about 30 years ago. So we don't have a train depot anymore. This building behind me is what we call the Pillow Store. This is at 701 Main Street. And if you can tell where we've walked so far, down there is the museum. Over there where I'm pointing, that's where we started. We walked up that half of Main Street. Then we crossed the street and went to City Hall. And then we went to the Pillow Park. And now we're going to walk down the other side of Main Street. We're going to go from right here all the way down to CPA Park, and we're going to look at the Pasco and Eudora fish statue. So as I was saying, this building is the Pillow Building. It was owned by Charles Pillow, the same man that built that large house that we just saw. And Charles Pillow was a German immigrant. He came over here from Germany, and he started this business, which was the town's general store. A general store at that time was basically the town's Walmart. This is where people would have come to get virtually all their housing supplies. This is where you would have gotten your food, your clothes, your tools, toys for kids. Everything would have been gotten out of this store. And in the process, Charles Pillow became pretty rich because of all the items that he sold. And later on, this building was home to other grocery stores. In the 1990s, this building became a recording studio. It's where people made music. Different bands would come in, a lot of them from Kansas City, and they made music here. And the first place, I believe, was called Red Brick Recording, and then later on it became Black Lodge Recording. And there was a band called the Get Up Kids. They're an emo band from Olathe. Ask your parents what emo means. And they made the records here. They also own the building. And then they've since sold it to a couple of people from California. I think they still use the recording equipment in there to make music. And this is a really important part of our history, this building. It's one of our oldest buildings. It was probably built about 1865. And there's one kind of neat thing about this building that I'll show you on the side here. On the north wall of this building, I'd say probably hundreds, maybe thousands of people over the years, they've carved their initials, in other words, into this brick here. And you can do that because this brick is very, very, very soft. You can take a little nail or a piece of rock and it almost comes right off. So if you're ever up here, carve your initials into this building sometime and become part of Eudora history. And it goes all the way down the side here. A couple of the cool ones here, that looks like an eyeball, I think. And there's a computer keyboard as well, carved right there. This building behind me is the Eudora State Bank building. It was first built in 1892. It was one of the first banks in the community. And one neat thing about this building is up at the top of it, there's a large piece of molding. It's called a cornice. And that's just basically a fancy add-on that they put to the building because banks wanted to make their buildings look really nice and fancy to show people we got a lot of money. So it's safe to put your money into this building. Probably the most interesting history of this building was that it was robbed by a bank robber twice. In the same year, in 1909, there was an 18-year-old boy from Lawrence. He rode over here on horseback, and he robbed the bank. He put the bank teller and a bystander, a civilian, into a safe. He took all the money, and he got away. And then 1 month later, he came back. He did the same thing again. But this time, the other people in town were ready for him. And they chased him on horse out of town. They managed to catch up to him. And right before he got caught, he shot himself in the head. And they brought his dying body to City Hall, and they put it on display where people would walk by and they'd look at the body. So that's kind of a tragic, eventful story that took place in this building. So this is just the post office. This building isn't that old. It was built in the 1960s. At various times, the post office was located in our building for about 30 years. From about 1897 to about 1925, it was at our building. From about 1925 to 1962, it moved up to the Caw Valley Bank building. And then since about 1962 or 1963, it's been at this building. This is the first building in Eudora that's been used just for a post office. So this building behind me, this is 711 Main Street. And this is one of the oldest buildings in Eudora as well. From what I can tell, it was built about 1870. And it was home to the Eudora Oddfellows, or I should say it still is home to the Eudora Oddfellows. The Oddfellows are a club of men only, mostly older men today, and they actually still meet up there. They take those steps up there to the second story, and they do secret club meeting stuff up there. So we don't know what they do up there. It's a private secret club. And you can see their logo right there, the IOOF, right there. And I'll point out to you, a lot of these older buildings, you can always tell when a building is pretty old based on what it's made out of. And on this building, for instance, you see it's made out of brick and rock, limestone. Limestone is what they built a lot of the buildings of back in the 1800s. And here is some very soft brick. And here's some newer modern brick that's hard. So you can kind of tell based on when bricks were made, based on how soft or how hard they are. So this is Jasmine, which I think is the best restaurant in all of Eudora. I hope everyone has gone to this at some point, and if you haven't, you should ask your parents to take you here. And so this building is a little over 100 years old, maybe 110 years old. When this building was first built, it was what we call a pool hall. I know what you're thinking, like swimming pool. It wasn't a swimming pool, but it was with pool tables. You know, that game with the green table and the long cue sticks. So this was a place where all the men in town would have come to play pool. And I hate to say it, but women typically weren't allowed in there. Women had to stay home, they had to do the cleaning, they had to take care of the kids. This was men and boys only in here. Thankfully, things aren't like that today. Today, men and women are a little more equally treated, but at the time, only men would have been able to go in this pool hall. This building behind me was first built in the 1870s, and in the 1870s, it was called the American Hotel. It was one of the couple of hotels in Eudora, and later on, it became a paint and wallpaper store. And what's cool about this building is when we walk towards the back of it, I'll show you something pretty cool that you probably have never seen before. So this blue building was a horse stable. And over here you can really see where the horses would have popped their heads out of. Horses could have stuck their heads out of those windows and you could feed them and give them water. Horse stables were really important. Think of them as basically a garage for your horse. Because if you remember, like I said earlier, back in the 1800s, cars didn't exist. The only way to get around was by train, by walking, or by horse. And horses were really expensive and they were really valuable pieces of property. They were, in many instances, the most important thing anyone owned was a horse. So they kept them safe and locked up at night. Because horse thieves were actually a real problem as well. Horses got stolen all the time back then. And so people would have kept an eye on their horses. And back in the 1800s, behind just about every one of these buildings, you would have seen a stable like this. But this is, I think, the only one that's still here, that still exists. I'm on the other side of the horse stable right now. And one cool thing that they found right here was a horseshoe up there above the door. Horses used to wear those on their hooves so they could get better traction in the mud. And somebody found that here, dug it up, and they put it on above the door there. And actually, you could probably start digging in a lot of these lots here in downtown Eudora, and you could find all sorts of old things. People do it all the time. People use metal detectors, and they scan the ground looking for old things. They find coins or plates, glasses, bullets. Sometimes people have found a gun, bayonet. You can find lots of old things buried around here. Don't start digging, though, unless you have the owner's permission. This building behind me, today it's a private house, but this was the first schoolhouse in all of Eudora. This building was built in 1860, and it was at where City Hall is today, where we just were a second ago looking at the school bell. And so this would have housed all the students in Eudora from 1860 to 1866, and then later on it became City Hall. And then in 1955 they picked it up and they moved it and they put it over here, and it's a private residence today. It's definitely one of the oldest buildings in Eudora. This is the Caw Valley Bank building. We just saw the original Caw Valley Bank building at the top of the street up there, which was built in 1897. In the 1960s, they moved into this building here, and they've been in operation in Eudora since the 1890s, so they're probably the oldest existing business in Eudora. There's a little point of interest to show you here. Right behind me are some steps that appeared to go to nothing. Well, there used to be a house right here that got torn down about 10 years ago. Right now, I've walked to the CPA Park, and I'm standing in front of the Pasco and Eudora fish statue. You've probably been in CPA Park before. It's where the CPA picnic is held every summer. And this is a very important statue to a lot of us in Eudora because it depicts Pasco and Eudora fish. Pasco Fish was a member of the Shawnee tribe. He was a Native American, and he owned all of the land that is today Eudora. In 1857, he sold his land for $10,000 to a German immigrant company. And they started the town Eudora that year, and they named it after Eudora Fish. That's Pascal's daughter. Eudora Fish was born in about 1803, and he lived to about 1891. He lived a long life. One of the things he did for a job was he was a ferry boat operator. And you can tell by looking at the statue because in Pascal's hand, he's holding a large oar, which he would have used to operate his ferry boat. Ferries were really important at that time because no bridges existed in Kansas at this time. The only way to get across a river was by boat. And Pascal and his brother operated probably the largest ferry boat in the area. Pascal's daughter grew up but died relatively young. She died at the age of 29. Both of them left Eudora. In the early 1870s, a lot of the Native Americans were forced out of Kansas, and she died at a young age of 29. She's buried in Kansas City. We don't know where Pascal's buried. We've never found that information out. But he died in the Indian Territory in 1894. This house right behind me is one of the oldest houses in Eudora. It was probably built in the 1860s. This is an important house because it was owned by the Still family. The Stills were the first Americans to settle in the Eudora area. There was a man named Abraham Still who came out here in 1850, and he opened up a mission for the local Shawnee Native Americans. And he was only here for a few years operating a mission, but his son stayed, and he ran a doctor's office here out of this house right here. And we think his doctor's office was probably in that room right there, and then he would have lived with his family on the other side of the house. The Stills were a pretty important family because one of Abraham's sons, a man named A.T. Still, went on to found the A.T. Still University in Kirksville, Missouri, which is the leading university in the U.S. in the field of osteopathy. Osteopathy is the study of your back. So the Stills became back doctors, very important ones at that. This building was a meat market for most of its existence. We know there was a meat market on this corner at least since 1900. Later on, this became home to Pile Meats. And this was essentially the town slaughterhouse. I usually ask the students if anyone knows what a slaughterhouse is, and usually a couple of students do. A slaughterhouse is where the farmers brought their animals to get killed to get butchered and turned into meat. So all the farmers would bring their cows or their pigs or chickens into this building, and they'd get converted into food. It's not a slaughterhouse anymore, which is a good thing because there was a pretty bad smell that came out of it from all the dead animals. Later on, this was a Cupcake Store, which is quite a bit different from a slaughterhouse. This building behind me today is a quilt store, but a long time ago this was a car garage. This was home to Rothberger Motor. So people came here to buy cars, and they also brought their cars here to get fixed. This building behind me is today known as the Lodge, and it's called that because for many years this was the Masonic Lodge. The Masons were a secret private group, just like the Oddfellows. They met in private and secret upstairs. There's the doorway right there that they would take to go upstairs. And they would rent the lower half of the building to different businesses to make money. And they had their secret meetings up there. They don't meet anymore though. They closed shop in 2000. But one cool thing about this building that I think is the only instance of downtown Eudora is at the very top of it, you can see the year that it was built. So it was built in 1891. And we've just about done a full circle on our walking tour of downtown Eudora. We're right next to the museum from where we started. And the last stop is this building right here. Today this is Zeb's Coffee Shop, but this building was originally known as the Trev's Variety Store. This was like a general store. It was a place where people came to purchase just about anything. And probably one of the coolest features about this building that's still intact is the ceiling. It still has an original tin ceiling.